Hey guys, I'm back to read more of The Wind in the Willows. Today we are on chapter 12 and it's the last chapter of the book. So chapter 12 is called The Return of Toad. When it began to grow dark, the rat called them all back into the parlor. He stood each of them beside one of the little heaps of weapons. Then he dressed them for the coming battle. When all was ready, the badger took a lantern in one paw, grasped his great stick with the other, and said, "Now then, follow me. Mole first, rat next, toad last. Toady, don't chatter." The badger led them along the river, and then suddenly swung himself over the edge into a hole, a little above the water. The mole and the rat followed. Toad, of course, managed to slip and fall into the water with a loud splash. The tunnel was cold, dark, damp, and low. Poor Toad began to shiver. The lantern was far ahead, and he could not help lagging behind in the darkness. The terror of being left behind seized him, and he ran forward with such a rush that he upset the rat into the mole and the mole into the badger. The badger thought they were being attacked. He drew a pistol and almost shot Toad. Then suddenly they heard, sounding far up over their heads, a confused murmur of sounds. The passage now began to slope upward. The sound of laughter and applause broke out, this time very close above them. "What a time those weasels are having," said the badger. They hurried along till they found themselves under the trap-door that led up into the pantry. The badger said, "Now, all together." Hoisting each other up, they found themselves standing in the pantry with only a door between them and their unsuspecting enemies. "Our thanks to clever Toad," a weasel laughed. "Just let me at him," muttered Toad. The badger drew himself up and shouted, "The hour is come," and flung the door wide open. The battle is about to begin. What a squealing, a squeaking, and screeching filled the air. Weasels dived under tables and sprang for the windows. Ferrets ran for the fireplace and jammed the chimney. Tables and chairs were upset, and glass and china crashed to the floor as the hero strode into the room. They were only four in all, but to the panic-stricken weasels the hall seemed full of monstrous animals whooping and waving enormous weapons. The battle was soon over as the terrified weasels shrieked across the lawn. On the floor lay a dozen or so of the enemy who did not escape. The mole was busily fitting handcuffs on them. "Mole," Badger said, "you're the best of fellows. Slip outside and check on the stout lookouts. I've an idea that thanks to you we won't have much trouble from them tonight." Toad felt rather hurt that the badger didn't say pleasant things to him as he had to the mole, and tell him what a fine fellow he was and how splendidly he had fought. For Toad was quite pleased with the way he himself had gone after the chief weasel and sent him flying across the table. Mole returned through the window chuckling. "From what I can tell," he reported, "even the stouts threw down their rifles and fled. They've all disappeared by now." "Excellent animal," said the badger. "Now, there's just one more thing. I want you to take those fellows on the floor there upstairs with you and have some bedrooms cleaned out. See that they sweep under the beds and put clean sheets and pillowcases on, and then put them out by the back door. I'm very pleased with you, Mole." The following morning Toad had overslept as usual. He came down to breakfast and found nothing to eat. This did not improve his temper. After all, it was his own house. Through the windows of the breakfast room he could see the mole and the rat sitting out on the lawn. The badger, who was in an armchair, remarked rather shortly, "I'm sorry, Toad, but I'm afraid there's a heavy morning's work in front of you. We really ought to have a banquet at once to celebrate this affair. It's expected of you, in fact, it's the rule. If we have the banquet tonight, the invitations will have to be written and sent at once. Now sit down at that table and write to all our friends. I'll lend a hand too. I'll order the banquet." "What?" cried Toad. "Me stay indoors and write a lot of rotten letters? I'll be why, of course, dear Badger. You wish it done, and it shall be done." The Badger looked at him with a suspicion, then left the room. As soon as the door had closed, Toad hurried to the writing table. A fine idea had occurred to him while he was talking. He would write the invitations, and he would take care to mention the leading part he had taken in the fight, and he would include a program of entertainment for the evening, something like this, as he had sketched it out in his head. Speech by Toad. There will be other speeches by Toad later. Address by Toad. Our prison system, the waterways of England. Horse stealing, on being an English squire. Song by Toad, composed by himself. Other compositions by Toad, sung in the evening by the composer. So there's Toad's invitation. Toad worked very hard on his letters. He got a weasel to help deliver them, and he had sent out all the invitations by noon. When the other animals came back, Badger and Rat caught Toad by the arm. "Now look here, Toad," said the Rat. "It's about this banquet. We know you too well. We want you to understand clearly, once and for all, that there are to be no speeches and no songs." "Can't I sing them just one little song?" Toad pleaded with sorrow in his eyes. "No, not one little song," replied the Rat. "You know well that your songs are all conceit and your speeches are all self-praise. It's for your own good, Toady." Toad at last raised his head. It was but a small thing, merely to hear the great applause that brings out my best qualities. And pressing his handkerchief to his face, he left the room. "It's lucky we came upon that little weasel just as he was setting out with Toad's invitation," said the Rat. "They were simply disgraceful. Fortunately, Mole has agreed to write out new invitation cards." "Good Mole," said Badger proudly. At last the hour for the banquet began to draw near. Toad had gone up to his bedroom to pout. After a while, however, he began giggling shyly to himself. He got up, locked the door, and drew the curtains across the windows. Then he set up all the chairs in the room in front of him, like an audience, and began to sing loudly and with great gusto Toad's last little song. The Toad came home. There was panic in the parlor and howling in the hall. There was crying in the cowshed and shrieking in the stall, when the Toad came home. When the Toad came home, there was smashing in of window and crashing in of door. There was pestering of weasels that fainted on the floor, when the Toad came home. So there's Toad singing about himself again. Bang go the drums, the trumpeters are tooting, and the soldiers are saluting, and the cannon they are shooting, and the motor cars are tooting as the hero comes. Shout hooray, and let each one of the crowd try, and shout it very loud in honor of an animal of whom you're justly proud, for it's It's Toad's great day. He sang it all over again, then he heaved a deep sigh, a long, long, long sigh, and then he parted his hair in the middle, slicked it down, unlocked the door, and went quietly down the stairs to greet his guests. All the animals cheered when Toad entered. They crowded round to congratulate him and say nice things about his courage, his cleverness, and his fighting qualities. But Toad only smiled and murmured, "Oh, it was nothing. Oh, please, really, not at all." So there's all of Toad's friends. Otter came forward with a shout and threw his arm around Toad's neck. Toad only remarked gently, "Badger was the mastermind. The Mole and Water Rat bore the brunt of the fighting. I merely served in the ranks and did little or nothing." The animals were puzzled by this unexpected attitude of his. Toad rather liked this new kind of attention. He moved from one guest to the other, making his modest responses, and thus everyone now found him to be very interesting. The Badger had ordered only the best, and the banquet was a great success. There was much talking, laughter, and joking among the animals. But through it all, Toad only murmured polite comments to the animals on either side of him. He never once remarked on himself. Badger and Rat were in shock at Toad's mannerly behavior, and this gave Toad the greatest satisfaction of all. There were some knockings on the table and cries of "Toad, speech! Speech from Toad! Song! Mr. Toad's song!" But Toad only shook his head gently, raised one paw, and smiled, asking his guests to eat and enjoy themselves. It was a banquet for them, not him. He was indeed an altered Toad. After this the four animals led their lives in great joy, respect, and contentment. Toad selected a handsome gold chain and locket set with pearls that he mailed to the jailer's daughter with a letter of thanks. Even the Badger admitted that this was a kind, thoughtful thing for Toad to do. Toad also wrote to properly thank the engine driver. He sent him some money for all his pains and troubles. Under severe pressure from Badger, Toad even found out where the barge woman was and sent her money for the horse he had stolen from her. A lawyer got all the charges against Toad dropped in exchange for time already served in prison. And because Toad had truly become a more mannerly Toad, everyone had now been rewarded for his or her part. Sometimes during long summer evenings, the friends would take a stroll together in the wild wood, now tamed. It was pleasing to see how nicely they were greeted by the animals who lived there. The mother weasels would bring their young ones to the doors of their dens and say, pointing, "Look, baby, there goes the great Mr. Toad, and that's the gallant water
Hello,
rat."
everyone. This is a COVID-19 announcement. To ensure everyone's safety, please remember to practice physical distancing or wearing a mask at all times while in the building. Thank you for your cooperation.
And that's the gallant water rat, a terrible fighter, walking alongside of him. And yonder comes the famous Mr. Mole. You've often heard your father tell of him. But when their children were irritable and quite beyond control, they would quiet them by telling how, if they didn't hush, the terrible gray badger would come and get them. This was not true at all about the badger, for though he did not care much about society, he was rather fond of children. But the mother weasel's words never failed to have their full effect. The end. And that's the end of our novel. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye bye.